So not every city metro is built up and developed the same way. Some cover a small land area and are relatively efficient, and some cover a very large land area and are not efficient. And it's not all just about population. However, there are some cities that really are just developed poorly and have been, and the urban sprawl is frankly just out of control. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the worst developed city metros in America. So without further ado, let's get started. So first we have Orlando, Florida, and no, this is not because of Mickey Land or the crazy amount of tourism that has been built around this city, but really just the vast amount of land area that this city covers. And you would think that this city would have been developed better because it has just got tons of lakes and ponds throughout it. But instead of building it efficiently, given that the land is not particularly that great for development, the city has just been built outward further and further. The freeway belt is about 32 miles across. A similarly sized city metro, St. Louis, is only about 20 miles in terms of its beltway across. This is one of the largest metros in America without any kind of commuter rail transit, and really the skyline just never got built up, so everything is just spread out everywhere. And ultimately, you just have a city that really is just a giant neighborhood rather than a centralized core with suburbs around it. And it really is raising the risk of runoff and high flooding in the area. Next we have Phoenix, Arizona. The sprawl of the Phoenix metro is so vast that you could go 60 miles and not leave a majorly populated area. For the 10th largest metro in America, the skyline is basically a joke, and aside from mountains which make it basically impossible to develop on, you won't see much breaks in the populated areas and housing around this city. There is some rail transit, but it's not particularly that useful compared to other metros. And the strange thing about Phoenix is you would think that it would be efficiently developed due to the fact that there's water scarcity here and so much additional energy is needed to power air conditioning for much of the year. And the spread out layout, no doubt, is a factor in this city having one of the worst air qualities in the country, since it is so dependent on long-range vehicle travel. Given the very intense heat of Phoenix, you would think that travel efficiency would have been a forefront in priority, but it has not been and is not due to the relatively flat and developable land around the city. And in some ways it's kind of the opposite of what you'd expect, because even though you might have property, you're not going to have a lawn for the most part here due to the climate. So even though there's plenty of space, there's just a lot less options in what you can do with it in terms of landscaping. Next we have Houston, Texas. Now they say everything's bigger in Texas. Well, that certainly applies to Houston. This may be the worst efficiency in terms of land use per population in the entire country. You could drive over 30 miles from the center of the downtown before you reach any kind of unpopulated area. And you could go almost 70 miles if you went end to end before you reach an unpopulated area in this metro. That's how spread out the population in Houston is. And due to being so spread out and car dependent, this city has some of the worst traffic and worst air quality in the country. And it just keeps growing and growing fast. There is a little bit of rail, but it's basically a joke. It's not going to take many people anywhere. It's really just in the deep internal part of the downtown. And like Phoenix, this is a very air conditioning dependent area, so that just creates more logistical issues in terms of the power grid. And there is now a higher risk of flooding due to this urban sprawl, due to the fact that there's just less places for storm runoff to go. And next we have Detroit. Now this one you'd think would be a little bit more efficiently developed due to the fact that this was a big city a very long time ago when cities were a lot more centralized. But this one is quite different than the other three. Even though rail was really big when Detroit was gaining a lot of population, Detroit never got a mass transit rail system built within the city. There were the streetcars, but those were gone by the 1950s. And if you didn't have mass rail by the 1950s, you probably weren't going to have it developed in your city, since that would be when the freeways would take off. But Detroit started off as fairly efficient in terms of its development. However, the suburbanization just got out of control in this city. People just kept moving further and further away from the city, and you couldn't move east because of the Canadian border and the waterways, the urban sprawl got so extreme that you can go 30 miles from the downtown core and still be in populated areas. Now, some of this was the trend of suburbanization during the post-war era. However, after the riots of 1967, the white flight from Detroit was really high, almost 150,000 in the 2 years after it occurred. So the population got really spread out, so much so that sporting venues were built roughly 30 miles away from downtown Detroit in the Pontiac Silverdome and the Palace of Auburn Hills. And there's no surrounding freeway beltway that connects really in a circular direction the entire city like many cities have. So getting from one end of the metro to another is not necessarily that easy depending on where you're going. And really one of the biggest challenges to Detroit ever making any kind of substantial comeback is you just have this giant void several miles long of urban prairie, scattered housing, and abandonment that's going to be really difficult to ever really redevelop. There's been investment in Detroit, but most of it's in that downtown, midtown core, and then you just have several miles of blighted areas, and then you have the wealthier far suburbs. Just overall, the lack of rail infrastructure, the mass suburbanization, and ultimately the vacating of tens of thousands of homes in this city have really left it with one of the worst urban sprawls in the country. And lastly, we have Los Angeles, California. For a city of this size, the downtown is pretty small, which is obviously a big factor in why the traffic is so bad, because there are just so many people spread along such a large, wide area. You can go 65 miles from the downtown core and still be in a very populated area. Now, some of this sprawl is due to the fact that there are geographical barriers such as mountains in the way, but ultimately for the second largest city and metro in the United States, the amount of tall buildings in its downtown pales in comparison to cities like New York City or Chicago. And heavily due to this, you have one of the worst air quality and traffic cities in the country. Is the mass transit system better than some of the other cities on this list? Yes, but you have to factor that there are a ton more people in this city than many of these other cities. So to sum it up here, really 4 out of these 5 cities developed during a different time where demands of consumers for housing and development were different. People wanted more land, and they didn't necessarily want to be right by where they worked. And so the city developed with the desires of the people. Cities like Orlando, Phoenix, and Houston are not like these old Rust Belt cities that peaked in population decades ago. They're still growing, and growing a lot. And thus residents of the metros are left with the sprawls that there are. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching.